They were known as raiders, warriors, and seafarers. But what if the Vikings were something more? Ancient Norse sagas speak of a bridge, Bifröst, a glowing arc that connected Midgard to other realms. Historians call it myth, but scattered across the northern hemisphere are unexplained ruins, archaic inscriptions, and oral traditions that speak of travelers arriving from the sea long before Columbus. What if Bifröst wasn't just a story, but a technology? What if some Vikings actually crossed it and never came back? What if their journey wasn't just across the Atlantic, but into another world entirely? And what if something followed them back? History remembers the Vikings as brutal warriors, raiders who burned monasteries and sailed longships through fog and fire. But history, as it's taught, is a carefully curated narrative, fragments preserved and approved. What it doesn't emphasize is what came before and after the violence. By the year 1000 AD, Norse explorers had already pushed far beyond their homeland, not just to Iceland and Greenland, but to a land they called Vinland. Mainstream historians equate this with parts of modern-day Newfoundland, but sagas from that time describe warm regions, wild grapes, dense forests, and strange creatures, unlike anything known in northern latitudes. These stories were not the delusions of madmen. They were documented oral accounts, passed down for generations, and they speak of encounters. In one such tale, a Norse chieftain described a shimmering sky that spoke with colors, and a storm that turned the sea to mirrors. They claimed to have landed on a coast with no stars above, only a perpetual dawn. The people they found there didn't speak, but stared, eyes black as obsidian, silent, watching. Archaeologists have dismissed these claims as poetic metaphors, expressions of wonder from men who had never seen a sunset in a different hemisphere. But what if it was more literal than anyone dared to admit? In 1472, a Venetian monk named Antonio Zeno published a letter, supposedly written by his ancestor, who had sailed with northern explorers centuries earlier. The letter described a journey across the Atlantic, guided by Norse sailors. It spoke of mysterious islands, strange metallic objects in the sky, and an expedition leader who vanished mid-voyage after walking into a dense mist at the shoreline of an uncharted land. This account was ridiculed, buried, and then forgotten. But fragments like these exist all across Norse and early European records. Strange disappearances, ships that set sail and were never heard from again. Reports of godmen arriving in boats with dragon heads, performing feats no human should be capable of. Could it be that some Vikings didn't just explore new lands, but crossed into something else entirely? In Norse mythology, Bifröst is described as a rainbow bridge, a radiant arc connecting Midgard, the realm of humans, to Asgard, the realm of gods. Most dismiss it as symbolic, a pretty metaphor for the path to heaven. But Norse sagas didn't treat it that way. They describe Bifröst with specific detail as a burning, vibrating structure that could only be crossed by the worthy. Its name translates roughly to shimmering path or moving way, and it was said to be guarded, not by metaphor, but by an actual being, Heimdall, whose senses could perceive threats before they had even formed. Some fringe theorists have long speculated that Bifröst wasn't allegory, but a form of ancient technology. A vibrational field, perhaps. An Einstein-Rosen bridge described in the only language primitive people had available: myth. Consider this. Ancient Norse culture didn't have the vocabulary for electromagnetic spectrum, wormholes, or dimensional rift. But they had the sky. They had color. They had awe. And what would you call a bridge of pulsing light and unnatural energy? if you stumbled upon one 1,000 years ago? You'd call it magic. You'd call it a rainbow bridge. There's precedent for this theory across other ancient cultures. In Hindu texts, vimanas were flying machines that shimmered and hummed, capable of traversing the ether between worlds. The Book of Enoch describes crystal corridors through the heavens. The Aboriginal Dreamtime speaks of glowing paths walked by sky beings who disappeared into the horizon. Time and time again, cultures isolated by oceans and language describe the same thing. So why not the Norse? Why not Bifröst? What if this bridge was real? Not physical in the sense of stone and iron, but a localized energetic anomaly, a rupture point where dimensional membranes wear thin. Under the right solar conditions, with the Earth's magnetosphere in flux, perhaps certain places acted like conduits. If Viking explorers happen upon such a location, driven by storms, cosmic cycles, or blind luck, they may have crossed into a parallel environment entirely. And if that's true, then what waited on the other side? When Norse explorers reached the edges of the known world, they expected beasts and barbarians. What they found, if the records are to be believed, were entities unlike anything in Europe. Across North America, from the Great Lakes to the forests of the Pacific Northwest, indigenous legends speak of pale-skinned visitors, armed with steel and speaking a harsh, guttural tongue. Some tribes called them skymen, others, those who shimmer. But the stories don't end with their arrival. They speak of disappearances, storms that crackled without clouds, and men whose minds fractured after wandering too far inland. In Inuit oral tradition, there are tales of the white ghosts, men who built ships of dragon bone and tried to map the ice, until they began to see lights under it. And in Hopi stories, there is mention of portals in the stone and visitors who stepped into them, only to return altered, with eyes full of thunder and voices that didn't match their mouths. Could these stories be distorted echoes of Viking contact? Or are they something deeper? Shared memory of a failed incursion into something inhuman? One unsettling clue lies in the Kensington runestone, found in Minnesota in 1898. It bears a runic inscription describing a Norse expedition, a deadly conflict, and survivors hiding after 10 men red with blood and death. The authenticity of the stone has been fiercely debated, but its language and grammar align too closely with medieval Swedish to be easily dismissed. Even more bizarre, several Native American artifacts, long dismissed as hoaxes, bear Norse-style etchings and carvings. One features a symbol nearly identical to the Valknut, a sigil associated with death, war, and Odin's power over souls. And then there are the missing colonies. The Norse settlement in Greenland, once thriving, vanished. No battle, no signs of mass disease, no bodies, just silence. At Lanceau Meadows, the only confirmed Viking site in North America, archaeologists found tools, structures, and hearths, but no graves. As if those who lived there didn't die, they simply left. Where? Back across the sea? Or through a threshold they could not explain? Some theorists believe they stumbled upon something forbidden, a rift or portal that briefly opened. Others believe it opened for them, and something else closed it behind them. What if the ancient Norse myths were never intended as stories to entertain, but rather as desperate attempts to encode experiences that defied understanding? To this day, scholars interpret their pantheon as symbolic projections of human nature, archetypes, or metaphors for natural forces. But what if they were eyewitness testimonies, translated across centuries of oral tradition, describing events so alien that only the language of gods and monsters could contain them? The cosmology of the Norse world was never vague. It was structured, layered, interconnected. 9 realms, each with distinct properties, atmospheres, and rules of existence, all bound together by Bifröst, the so-called Rainbow Bridge. These realms were not mere metaphors. Their descriptions contain far too much detail to be dismissed as imagination. Some were realms of mist and shadow, others of ice and fog, of fire and chaos, of beings whose size or behavior violated the norms of known life. The inhabitants of these worlds were not spirits or illusions. They had names, territories, and roles, and in many cases, they had conflicts with the humans of Midgard. The gods themselves behaved in ways that feel strangely grounded. They were powerful, but not omnipotent. They struggled. They suffered. They even died. Unlike the deities of many other ancient religions, the Aesir and Vanir were bound by consequences. They used tools, hammers, spears, ships, and mead to achieve their ends. And these tools, as described, possessed properties that today feel uncannily familiar. A hammer that returns when thrown and emits thunder. A spear that never misses. A ship that folds into something pocket-sized, but can expand to carry an army. Are these magical items? Or are they glimpses of technology so far advanced, it could only be interpreted as divine by those who witnessed it? Odin is perhaps the most revealing figure in this regard. He is portrayed as a god of knowledge, but not the kind granted by birthright. He seeks it obsessively. He sacrifices an eye for wisdom. He hangs himself on the world tree for 9 nights in pursuit of deeper vision. What are these if not rituals of altered consciousness? The imagery evokes the kind of out-of-body experience described by mystics, shamans, and even modern psychonauts. Could the myth of Odin's sacrifice be a memory of contact? A replication of a method that allowed the Norse seers to interface with something beyond the veil of ordinary perception? Even the end of the Norse world, Ragnarok, reads less like eschatology and more like catastrophe, a dimensional collapse. In the stories, the sun and moon are consumed, the sky is torn, Bifröst breaks, monsters pour into the world from beyond the known realms, the gods fall. It is not salvation or judgment. It is breach and annihilation. Some have speculated that this tale is not a prophecy, but a recollection, that the Norse did not merely dream of the end, they witnessed it. Or rather, those who returned from the crossing brought back a fragmented report of what happens when gateways open and should not. If all of this is true, if the myths are records encoded in story and song, then they may contain more than warnings. They may contain coordinates, descriptions, triggers. Perhaps some of these tales are not warnings against belief, but warnings against action. Not do not imagine, but rather do not follow. If the Norse myths were more than stories, if they were coded memories of real interactions with forces or locations beyond our comprehension, then the next logical question is where? Where did these crossings occur? Where did Bifröst touch the earth, if it ever did? The sagas are not explicit, but they hint. They speak of liminal places, wild places, lands at the edge of the known world, and often the clues align with regions where our modern instruments have detected anomalies, not just in topography, but in magnetism, radiation, and time perception itself. In Iceland, there are regions where compasses spin without reason, where animals refuse to pass, and where locals speak in hushed tones about lights that emerge from the ground rather than the sky. Some of these sites, like Thingvellir or the volcanic plains of Askja, have long been associated with the gods, not in the poetic sense, but as actual points of arrival and disappearance. In northern Norway, the ancient Sami people tell stories of paths through the aurora, not into the sky, but across it, into other states of being. Near the Lofoten Islands, fishermen have for generations reported seeing ghost ships that vanish not into fog, but into perfectly clear air, as if slipping through some invisible seam. One of the most compelling patterns lies not in the north, but in the west. Across parts of Newfoundland, Quebec, and even the Dakotas, there are clusters of sites where strange inscriptions, anomalous stone arrangements, and artifacts appear. but always without context, without origin. Local First Nations tribes speak of times when the wind changed and voices came from inside stone. They speak of holes in the world that shimmered like water, even when dry, and they speak of visitors who came, left gifts of metal and fire, then vanished without a trace. These accounts are never boastful. They are fearful, restrained, as if retelling them too boldly might draw the attention of whatever still lingers near those places. In recent decades, researchers studying Earth's magnetic field have noticed patterns in some of these regions. Localized pulses, brief but intense, often in places with no tectonic instability or obvious geological explanation. The electromagnetic spikes are consistent with what we might expect from rapid particle movement, gravitational distortion, or even sudden shifts in space-time curvature. Of course, in scientific terms, such ideas are speculative at best. But if ancient people witnessed similar phenomena without language for quantum flux or dimensional rift, how else could they describe it except in terms of burning bridges, rainbow roads, and gods walking across light? In Greenland, where Norse colonies once thrived and then disappeared, satellite imaging has revealed unusual symmetrical depressions beneath glacial ice. Some claim they are the remnants of ancient settlements. Others believe they may be artificial, built around something that is no longer entirely of this world. Most research in these areas is restricted. Excavation permits are rarely granted. Data from magnetic readings is often classified or simply not released. It's as if something or someone does not want further attention drawn to these coordinates. Could it be that the old crossing points still exist? Could Bifröst or its shattered echoes still flicker into being during rare cosmic alignments or geomagnetic storms? If so, then the gate was never truly destroyed, only closed. And perhaps not all the travelers returned. If even a fragment of these theories is true, if Viking explorers truly crossed into something beyond the limits of our world, then the question no longer centers on where they went. The real question is what may have come back. History does not speak clearly of a return, but there are echoes, scattered traces that suggest some did reemerge, changed, fractured, half haunted by what they saw or brought with them. In some regions of Scandinavia, there are tales of men who came home without explanation, bearing wounds that would not heal and eyes that refused to meet the sky. They no longer spoke the same dialects. They no longer slept. Villagers whispered that they dreamt with their eyes open, muttering in rhythms that resembled no known tongue. And then they would disappear again, drawn by the phases of the moon or by voices that only they could hear. These stories were not recorded in scholarly texts, but preserved in family lines, passed down in private warnings. If he returns from the sea with silence in his mouth, do not let him in. There are other traces too, archaeological, atmospheric, psychological. In remote areas where these myths are most deeply rooted, there are fluctuations in electromagnetic fields that persist even when solar activity is absent. Animals avoid these places. People report feeling watched, even when alone. And then there are the dreams. Consistent patterns among those who live near ancient Norse settlements or near locations that once held Viking structures. They speak of bridges of light, of voices humming beneath the earth, of something massive that waits behind a door that isn't there. Psychologists label it cultural imprinting, but the dreams predate the books. In 1997, a classified Scandinavian geological survey was leaked, detailing seismic activity deep beneath an uninhabited fjord. The data was odd, not because of magnitude, but because of the harmonic signature. It wasn't a quake. It was a pulse, rhythmic, sustained, as if something vast was breathing miles below. The report was quickly buried. The lead researcher left the country and never published again. But a copy of the data remains in private hands, and some who've seen the waveforms say they match low-frequency signals recorded near magnetic anomalies in the Arctic, where ancient Norse voyages once passed, and where modern governments still refuse civilian access. There's also the question of the spiral, found carved into stone in remote valleys, scrawled into cave walls, tattooed on skin in pre-Christian burial sites. The spiral appears again and again, not as art, but as warning, always rotating inward, always tightening. Some interpret it as a symbol of descent, of being pulled toward a point of no return. Others see it as a gate, one that spins only one way. In modern times, the spiral returned in a different form. In 2009, over Norway, a spiraling light appeared in the sky, seen by thousands. It was called a failed missile test. But the pattern was too perfect, too symmetrical. Those who witnessed it said they felt pressure in their skulls, a vibration in their bones. Some were later diagnosed with tinnitus, others with vivid sleep disturbances that began that night and never left. If these are coincidences, they form a pattern. And if they're not, they paint a terrifying picture. Because it means something was left open. Not fully, not enough to flood the world, but enough to bleed. Enough for memories to leak. Enough for travelers to return. And if even one of those travelers was changed by what they saw, if they brought back more than memories, then the crossing was not one way. We often speak of ancient myths as warnings, but myths don't repeat. Patterns do. And perhaps we are entering another cycle now, one in which the veil thins again. Solar activity is increasing. Magnetic poles are drifting. Unexplained sky phenomena are on the rise. And beneath the ground, the hum returns. In frequencies we cannot hear. In dreams we do not remember. In instincts that tell us something is not right. That something once crossed over and may soon do so again.